I bought an MSI GTX 1650 amidst this shortage, and let me tell you my experience. Today is the 5th day of surviving without a GPU, without a PC. Hey dad, that guy called you? Which guy? The 3060 Ti guy. Yeah, he did. Have a look at this. 85,000 for a 3060 Ti? This is ridiculous. Yes, scalpers are in full form, and graphics cards are selling at thrice their MRP. And my good old RX 560 had to stop working just at this time. So I got this MSI GTX 1650 Ventus XS OC at around 1.5 times the MRP. Now those are scalped rates, but there wasn't a better deal available. This graphics card has modest packaging. The box was battered and it had no seal, which a customer won't like, especially when it is already being sold at a scalped rate. Inside the box we get some write-ups and manuals, and the graphics card is inside a plastic non-static bag. Pretty solid. Also, it came with a plastic cover on the PCIe connector along with plastic covers on every display port. That is pretty cool. Talking about the design, this card is compact, and that makes sense. Now look, the GTX 1650 is a budget GPU, and gamers who will buy this card are typically on a budget, and they mainly go for M-ATX cases and M-ATX boards because they cost cheaper. And for those builds, this card would fit perfectly fine. Nice job, MSI. But this card doesn't have a backplate, which is a bit underwhelming. No MSI 1650 cards have backplates. That is okay for the Ventus XS version because this is a budget-oriented and compact version. But I would have loved a backplate in the Gaming X version. Also, talking about the Gaming X, that card is a big brother of this Ventus XS. As YouTuber Tactic pointed out, a part of the PCB in that card is wasted. Doesn't make sense. The Ventus XS OC has two 90mm fans. That is pretty sweet. It has an HDMI port, a DVI port, and a display port. But I would have loved two display ports in place of that DVI. At first I was a bit confused with the design, but from there I have gone to I'm okay with it, and now I love it. Now let's address the elephant in the room, performance. We ran lots of benchmarks in AAA titles as well as benchmark software. The results are pretty interesting. Starting with the new arrival Days Gone, as beautiful as it is, this card scores 58 frames on average while running the game in the very high preset. As this game was originally developed to be played in 30 FPS, we tried cranking up the settings to ultra, but this card didn't really like that. With frequent stutters and frame time spikes, the game was unplayable until the PC completely crashed. Weird. Moving over to the crash of the generation Cyberpunk 2077, we cranked the settings all the way up to ultra with ray tracing and DLSS off, as this card doesn't support them. We get 28 frames on average with 17 and 9 frames on 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Not the performance you would want in an FPS, but the game is just above the playable level. You can always crank the settings down, but hey, this is a GPU benchmark. Moving to Far Cry New Dawn, an entirely playable experience with almost 60 frames per second on average, but the huge parity between the average frame rate and 1 and 0.1% lows gives a few hiccups here and there. But this is a single player title. I would definitely want the game to look as good as possible, and just ignore them. In Fortnite Chapter 2 Season 7, we get a stuttery experience thanks to Epic's stubborn mentality. It's been 2 years since that game came out, and they have done nothing about the stutters. Also, this card was doing 60 frames per second on average in Chapter 2 Season 6. Season 7 brought better graphics and the frame rate went down. In Grand Theft Auto 5, we mixed driving in the extremely demanding grassy hills and driving in the freeways in Los Santos. Despite those bad 1 and 0.1% lows, the game is entirely playable because there was a huge frame rate difference in Los Santos and the grassy hills. In Horizon Zero Dawn, we get 35 frames on average with some bad 1 and 0.1% lows. Now this game got some varying performance in big settlements, in forests and in deserts, but the game is completely playable considering the fact that this was developed to be played in 30 frames per second. Nevertheless, this game is completely playable even in the highest possible settings because this is a single player console port. In Rainbow Six Siege, we get 180 plus frames on average, which proves this card's worth for esports. It is overly playable despite those terrible 0.1% lows, and the only limiting factor will be your skills. In Red Dead Redemption 2, we get 36 frames on average in the Ultra preset. The game looks beautiful and it also has some good 1% and 0.1% lows. Worth it. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we get amazing performance in the Ultra preset with an average of 56 frames per second and some okay 1% and 0.1% lows. And that's for it. Moving over to the benchmark software, we tried 3D Mark, Time Spy, Firestrike, PC Mark 10, FurMark, and Unigine Valley and Superposition. The bench setup that we used for all these tests included an i5-9400F along with 16 gigs of DDR4 2400 RAM and the 1650. That processor will not bottleneck this card. We will be GPU bound. So starting with 3D Mark Time Spy, it scores 3831 points and it's below standard for a gaming computer according to 3D Mark. But you know both the price of this thing and the performance. And moving over to the Firestrike Benchmark, we scored 9132 points and that again is substandard according to 3D Mark. But we have already seen how it performs in games. Moving over to FurMark, we scored 3725 points with 62 frames per second. That is just below the GTX 970, which takes a lead of 173 points, and we are just above the Radeon HD 6970, which is lagging by 220 points. Well, I'm impressed. Now let's talk about Unigine Valley. We scored 2142 points with the Extreme HD in 1080p and we happily take the 379th position in the LTT leaderboard. We are right on par with the Phantom 2 X4 965 along with the R9 290. Well, that is a big processor bottleneck there. That card will perform more than this card if it gets a better processor. In Superposition, well, the heaviest benchmark on the list, we scored 1916 points. And we secured the 2728th position in the leaderboard, and that is just below a high-end 2017 gaming laptop. Okay, so that's for all the base scores you can get. But what do you think about increasing the performance? Why not overclock this GPU? Let's go overclock it. So we applied a core offset of plus 100 MHz and a memory offset of plus 300 MHz. Now let's do all the benchmarks again. And there we are. 3D Mark Time Spy scores jump from 3831 to 4047. And that is a substantial increase. Moving over to Firestrike, we scored 9356 points, up from 9132. Pretty decent. In Cyberpunk 2077, we get an average of 33 frames with 23 and 20 frames as 1% and 0.1% lows. That is up from 28, 17 and 9 frames that we got before OC. Pretty solid performance gain. The biggest performance gain was in Superposition benchmark. We scored 2008 points, up from 1916. That is a very big performance gain. We ran the FurMark GPU stress for 35 minutes straight after overclocking this thing, and the temperatures hovered somewhere between 66 and 67 degrees Celsius. And there weren't any performance hiccups in terms of frame rate spikes or stutters. Now before overclocking this thing, we also tried running the OC scanner to scan the best possible OC settings for this thing. But considering the FurMark GPU stress test results after manually overclocking this thing to higher than the most stable clocks, we're quite good with the manually set clocks. That's the end of all observations. Now before I give my opinion on this card, I would like you to go down into the comment section and write what you feel about this thing. I've shared the entire review procedure, so come on man. Anyways, I think a 1650 is a 1650. It replaces the aging 1050 Ti and it does the job pretty good. Really have any special complaints about its performance? Well, at this price point, we can't ask for more. It can play all the recent games at high to even ultra settings in a few titles. And although the benchmark scores are underwhelming, if it does the job, who will complain? The benchmarks are against the most enthusiast hardware out there, probably 3090s and 5900Xs, but this setup costs only a quarter of what a 3090 or a 5900X cost. And if at this price point it can deliver performance, I don't think that there is any reason to ditch this thing. Well, I strongly recommend the MSI Ventus XS OC version of the GTX 1650 because this thing has been built for overclocking, which you would want in an already low performing GPU. The Gaming X version is kind of an overkill, but if you want to overclock further, you would want the Gaming X version. Also, amid the shortage, GPUs are being excessively scalped. I had to face those scalpers and it's really very frustrating and depressing. If you want to know more about the shortage, why things happen in the first place, case, click on the card here. I've talked about it in detail. Don't forget to like the video, and I hope to see you again in the next video.